The fifth psalm is also a psalm of lament by David. We don't know the exact occasion, but it was probably during that same period as Psalms 3 and 4 when David was betrayed by his son Absalom. In particular, in this psalm, he is complaining about those that are speaking ill of him and unjustly accusing him. As a lament, we're going to take a look at the various elements of a lament. And first, we start with the terms of address, and it's primarily Lord or Yahweh, with a few others, my King, my God, in verse 2. Begin with 3 requests: give ear to my words, consider my groaning, give attention to the sound of my cry, followed by statements of confidence. To you I pray, in the morning you hear my voice, in the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. Verses 4 through 6 are actually a complaint. It's not explicitly stated, but it's clear that David is angry and upset with those who are speaking lies, who are seeking to destroy his life. And so we're going to consider that a complaint. Again, terms of address, we have Yahweh, verse 10, O God. Confidence in verse 7, which I believe is the central verse of the psalm. A prayer following in verse 8, another complaint in verse 9, and another request specifically related to the complaint in verse 9, and then a conclusion of trust. And so David ranges from complaint to request and to confidence. Now zooming in on the language, notice again this grouping of 3. We saw that in Psalms 3 and 4 as well. Here we have 3 requests. The central one is to consider my groaning. The word groaning is the Hebrew word hagah, which also occurred in Psalm 1 and in Psalm 2. In Psalm 1, the blessed person delights in the law of the Lord and meditates, hagahs, on the law of the Lord day and night. In Psalm 2, it were the nations that were grumbling and complaining and meditating against the Lord and against his anointed. And here it's the psalmist who is groaning, muttering, mumbling in his request. This is a morning prayer. 2 Samuel 15:2 tells us that it was in the morning when cases were brought before the court. So perhaps David here is thinking of God bringing his case before God in the morning. I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. David may here be referring to a literal sacrifice, a cultic sacrifice, similar to Psalm 4, verse 5, where he said, offer righteous sacrifices. And as he would do so, he would watch and pray and wait for God to answer. In verses 4, 5, and 6, we see some similarities to Psalm 1 in its language of delight, of the wicked not standing, dwelling with God. We see in verses 5 and 6 3 statements of what God does. He hates evildoers. He destroys those who speak lies. He abhors the bloodthirsty. In verse 4, we saw what God does not do. He does not delight in wickedness. Evil may not dwell. The boastful shall not stand. So 3 negatives followed by 3 positive statements. Verse 7 speaks of God's steadfast love, his chesed, his faithful covenant love that David experiences in abundance. And David says because of that, he can enter God's house. He can bow down towards God's holy temple. It raises the question, what temple is David referring to? Because the temple had not yet been built. His son Solomon would do that. So either a later editor inserted the word temple here, or more likely, I think David is referring to the tabernacle as the temple, even though the temple specifically, the building had not yet been constructed. Verse 8 reminds us of the 23rd Psalm, that God leads us in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The phrase, your way, reminds us again of Psalm 1. In verse 9, we have a pretty solid metaphor. Their throat is an open grave. An open grave would be obviously a place of uncleanness, of rot, of death, of decay, smell, all things gross. And David says that this is what their mouth is. The words that are coming out of their mouth are death, are filthy. Notice the parallel with the word abundance in verse 7 and verse 10, whether it's the abundance of God's steadfast love and how that contrasts with the abundance of the transgressions of the wicked. Verse 11, similar to Psalm 2, verse 12 as well. Blessed are all who take refuge in you. Let them ever sing for joy. May they exult in you. This is the first use of the word sing in the Psalms, and it certainly won't be the last. Verse 12 reminds us of Psalm 1 as well. God blesses the righteous person and covers them with favor as with a shield of protection. We don't know the exact occasion of this, but we know that David felt falsely accused. Words were being thrown against him, and yes, words hurt. And so David prays in response to those false words. And he reminds himself through his prayer of these truths about who God is. First, God is sovereign. He is identified as David's king. He is the king's king. God is also near, this anthropomorphism, God listening, God's ear drawing close, paying attention. Those are ways of expressing God's actions in human terms. Verses 4 through 6 remind us of God's absolute holiness. God cannot be in the presence of evil. He is absolutely holy. Habakkuk 1:13 says of God, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil cannot look at wrong. God cannot see it. He can't stand it. He can't dwell in the presence of the wicked. And that makes verse 7 all the more striking, because David says, I, through the abundance of your chesed, your steadfast love, will enter your house. God, I can live with you. The wicked can't. You can't stand their presence, but because of your grace, I can live with you. I can move into your house. Verse 10 is David appealing to God's justice. Make them bear their guilt, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. May they get what's coming to them. May what goes around come around. And then finally, God is a refuge, a blessing, and a protection for his people. Why is Psalm 5 Psalm 5? Well, we see, first of all, a lot of common words in the first 5 Psalms. A lot of these overlap, and so can't help but link them together. And then I think perhaps you can make a case that Psalm 5 is the central of the first 5 Psalms of lament. Certainly, numerically, it falls in the middle of them. And verse 7 falls in the middle of Psalm 5, and it tells us, here's what we do in lamentable situations, particularly when we're injured by words. We enter into God's house. We bow down towards his holy temple. We worship and we trust in our just God. Now, Jesus comes to mind when I think of verse 3. It says in Mark 1 that very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, went out, and he prayed. And Jesus sets the example of early morning prayer, and would be good for us to do so as well. Just as David began his morning beseeching God, Jesus apparently did too, so that's a good habit to follow. Jesus also comes to mind in verse 7 when we speak of access to God's presence and his grace. The writer of Hebrews uses this image when he says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, David could be confident that he could enter God's house because of God's steadfast love, but we have that confidence even more certain. It's not just a promise of God, but it's a promise that was fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ, who went ahead of us, is our great high priest who intercedes on our behalf, who has made a way for us to enter into the very presence of God. The psalm is quoted directly by Paul in Romans 3 in his litany of verses on the sinfulness of mankind. Of course, the psalmist here is speaking of his enemies. Paul is saying, well, actually, this is really all of us. Yeah, all of us have potty mouths, right? As far as personal application, I love the fact that the psalmist uses the word groaning here, because sometimes there are no words. Sometimes we can't even express our prayers to God in human language. There's just a groaning There's just a crying out. Reminds me also of Romans 8:26 and 27, where the Holy Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. God intercedes for us in the Holy Spirit. God hears our groans even when there are no words. Verse 3 reminds us of the importance of morning prayer, of starting each morning with your first conversation with the most important person in the cosmos, God our Creator. A good way to start the day, to orient your life around the Lord. In verse 7, maybe my favorite verse in this psalm, that we have the privilege of approaching the throne of grace with confidence. Even though God cannot abide with the wicked, he cannot dwell with evil, he welcomes us into his home to bow down and to worship him. Verse 10 reminds us that when we've been unjustly accused, when we've been lied about, when we've been slandered and gossiped about, we got to let that go. We have to release our desire for vengeance and give that to God and allow God's justice to do its work. That what goes around comes around, and the wicked will be repaid. We don't have to do that. We don't have to bear that responsibility to do justice. God has taken care of that for us. And so we can sing and we can put our trust in God. We can enjoy God's favor, his shield of protection. All of those blessings are ours